"Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The words didn't echo loudly, but they landed heavy enough to turn heads. Conversations dimmed. Shoes paused mid-step on the polished marble floor. And in the middle of it all stood Ethan Cole, his worn leather jacket creased from years of use, his hand gently wrapped around the smaller, trembling fingers of his 8-year-old daughter. He didn't move. He didn't argue. He simply looked at the security guard with a calm that didn't match the moment. "We're just here for the scholarship event," Ethan said quietly. His voice was steady, respectful, almost too soft for the tension building around them. The guard shifted, adjusting the earpiece clipped to his collar, his posture firm but not cruel, just certain. "This is a private corporate function," he replied. "You need proper credentials." A few people nearby exchanged glances. Someone whispered. Another let out a short, dismissive chuckle. The kind that wasn't meant to hurt, but always did. Ethan's daughter tightened her grip. Her sneakers, slightly scuffed at the toes, tapped nervously against the spotless floor. "Daddy," she murmured, barely audible. Ethan crouched slightly, lowering himself to her level, his voice dropping into something warmer, steadier. "Hey," he said gently, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face, "we don't argue, okay? We walk with dignity." She nodded, though her eyes shimmered with confusion more than understanding. Behind them, the glass doors reflected a world that didn't seem to include them, tailored suits, polished heels, confident laughter. A different kind of life. The guard stepped closer, not aggressive, but firm enough to close the space. "Sir, I'm asking you one more time." Ethan rose slowly, his movements deliberate, unhurried. There was no anger in his face. No embarrassment either. Just something quieter. Something older. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from weakness, but from knowing exactly who you are, even when no one else does. A man in a navy suit glanced over, his eyes briefly catching on Ethan's wrist. A watch. Old, understated, but not cheap. His brow furrowed for just a second, then he looked away, unsure. Why it mattered? The air shifted slightly, like the moment before a storm no one could quite see yet. Ethan gave a small nod. "We'll go," he said simply. No resistance. No scene. Just quiet acceptance. But as he turned, his daughter looked back at the towering lobby, at the chandeliers glowing above, at the people who hadn't even tried to understand. And for a brief second, something in her expression asked a question the world wasn't ready to answer. Because what no one in that room realized, not the guard, not the guests, not even the man who had almost noticed, was that they weren't watching a man being turned away. They were watching a man walk out of something he once built, and choosing silence instead of recognition. The glass doors slid open with a quiet hiss, and the warm air of the street replaced the polished chill of the lobby behind them, but Ethan did not look back, not even once, not at the marble floors, not at the eyes that had already forgotten him. He simply stepped forward into the late afternoon light, his daughter walking beside him in silence, her small hand still wrapped tightly in his as if letting go might mean losing something she could not name. And for a few steps neither of them spoke. Only the distant hum of traffic and the soft rustle of wind between buildings filled the space where words might have been. Then finally she looked up at him, her voice careful, almost afraid of the answer. "Daddy, did we do something wrong?" Ethan slowed, not stopping completely, just enough to soften the moment, and he exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried more memory than air. "No," he said gently, "sometimes people just do not see clearly." She frowned slightly, trying to understand something that felt bigger than her years, and Ethan gave a faint smile, not forced, not broken, just steady. "And when that happens, we do not fight to be seen, we just keep walking the right way." Behind them, inside the building they had just left, something subtle had begun to shift. The man in the navy suit who had noticed the watch earlier stood still now, his thoughts lingering longer than he expected. He replayed the image in his mind, the worn jacket, the calm posture, the quiet voice, and then that watch again, not flashy, not modern, but familiar in a way that unsettled him, like a memory that refused to fully surface. He turned slightly toward a nearby colleague, lowering his voice. "Did you see that guy?" The colleague shrugged, already distracted, "just someone who did not belong." but the man did not answer, because something about that explanation felt incomplete, almost careless, like it ignored a detail that mattered more than it should. Back outside, Ethan and his daughter reached the edge of the sidewalk, the city stretching ahead in long lines of glass and steel, people moving past them without pause, without notice, and yet Ethan's pace remained unchanged, calm, measured, grounded, as if the world's opinion had no authority over his direction. His daughter glanced back once, just once, at the towering building behind them, its reflection glowing gold in the setting sun, and for a moment she looked like she wanted to say something more, to ask why they were leaving, to ask why it felt unfair, but she did not, because something in her father's silence told her that the answer was not found in arguing, it was found in understanding. And just as they prepared to step off the curb, a voice from behind the glass doors called out faintly, not loud, not commanding, but different, urgent in a way that did not match the calm surface of the building they had left. And though Ethan did not turn immediately, something in the air shifted again, quieter now, heavier, like the beginning of recognition slowly finding its way to the surface, not through noise, but through truth. The voice came again, clearer this time, cutting through the muted hum of the city like a thread pulling something unfinished back into place. Wait, please, wait. It was not loud, not commanding, but it carried a weight that made a few people near the entrance pause, and inside the lobby, the man in the navy suit had already turned fully now, his eyes fixed on Ethan's back as if trying to match the present with a memory that refused to stay buried. His steps quickened, not running, but urgent enough to break the polished rhythm of the event behind him, while outside Ethan had already stepped off the curb, guiding his daughter carefully across the street, his attention steady, grounded in the moment rather than the noise behind him, because for him, moments like this were not new, they were simply another quiet test of character, and he had learned long ago that dignity was not something you defended loudly, it was something you carried even when no one recognized it. His daughter glanced up again, her voice softer now. "Daddy, someone is calling you." Ethan heard it, of course he did, but he did not stop immediately, not out of pride, but out of habit, because in his world, recognition had never been something you chased, and yet the voice came closer, footsteps now crossing the threshold behind them, echoing faintly against the sidewalk. Ethan, the name landed differently, not like a guess, not like a question, but like certainty, and that was what made him slow. Just for a fraction of a second, just enough for the moment to shift. He turned slightly, not fully, just enough to see over his shoulder, and there stood the man in the navy suit, slightly out of breath, his composed exterior now edged with something more human, more uncertain. "I knew it," the man said quietly, almost to himself, his eyes dropping briefly to Ethan's wrist before lifting again. "That watch. I have seen it before." Ethan did not respond right away, his expression calm, unreadable, but not closed, just careful, like someone measuring whether the past deserved to be opened again. The man took another step closer, lowering his voice. "You were there, 5 years ago, during the restructuring, the night everything almost collapsed." A pause, the kind that holds more truth than words. "You are the one who kept the company alive." The air seemed to still for a moment, the passing cars, the distant conversations, even the wind felt quieter, as if the world itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Ethan's daughter looked between them, confusion mixing with curiosity, her small hand still holding his, grounding him in the present, and Ethan finally spoke, his voice even, without pride, without denial. "That was a long time ago." The man shook his head slowly, a faint disbelief in his expression. "No, it is not something that time erases." He glanced back toward the building, then back at Ethan. "You should not have been treated like that." Ethan's gaze softened slightly, not with agreement, but with understanding. "People act based on what they see," he said quietly, "and sometimes what they see is not the whole truth." The man exhaled, as if realizing the weight of what had just almost been lost. Not a person, but a story, a legacy, a truth hidden behind simplicity, and behind the glass doors, more eyes had begun to turn, drawn not by noise, but by the quiet gravity of recognition slowly unfolding, because in that moment, what had started as dismissal was beginning to transform into something far more powerful, the first fragile step toward respect. The man in the navy suit hesitated for a brief second, then straightened as if a decision had just settled inside him, something no longer optional, something that demanded to be seen through. "You cannot just walk away," he said, not forcefully, but with a quiet urgency that carried respect rather than control, and Ethan turned a little more this time, enough for his daughter to shift slightly beside him. her eyes moving between the two men as if she could feel the weight of something changing. Even if she did not yet understand it, we were already leaving, Ethan replied calmly, his tone even, not defensive, not dismissive, just grounded, the kind of voice that did not need to rise to be heard. The man shook his head, glancing briefly toward the building where figures had begun to gather behind the glass, watching now, not with amusement, but with curiosity that was slowly turning into concern. That is exactly why you should not, he said, lowering his voice, because what just happened in there, it is not right. Ethan's gaze lingered on him for a moment, not challenging, just measuring, and then he gave a faint nod. Right and wrong are not always loud, he said quietly, sometimes they show themselves later. The words settled between them, simple, but heavier than they sounded, and the man exhaled slowly, as if realizing he was speaking to someone who did not need convincing, only recognition. At least let me bring you back inside, he added, softer now, almost asking instead of insisting. Ethan glanced down at his daughter, her small fingers still holding onto him, her trust steady, unwavering, and he gave her a gentle look. What do you think? He asked, not as a test, but as an invitation. She hesitated, then looked back at the building, then at him. Only if you come too, she said quietly, and something in that answer carried more clarity than any adult explanation ever could. Ethan gave a small smile, the kind that did not need to be seen to be real, and then he looked back at the man. We will step back for a moment, he said, but not for recognition. The man nodded immediately, understanding the difference, and together they turned, walking back toward the glass doors, not as intruders, not as guests, but as something else entirely, something that had not yet been named by the room waiting inside. As the doors opened again, the atmosphere had changed, conversations had softened, movement slowed, and the security guard who had spoken earlier now stood a little straighter, his certainty no longer as firm as before, his eyes flicking toward Ethan with something new, not fear, not guilt, but uncertainty, the kind that appears when a story begins to unfold in a direction no one expected. And from deeper inside the lobby, a figure stepped forward, composed, deliberate, the rhythm of her heels precise against the marble. Victoria Hayes, the chief executive officer, her presence quiet but commanding, not because she demanded attention, but because attention followed her naturally. She had seen the movement, heard just enough of the exchange, and now her eyes rested on Ethan, steady, searching, not with judgment, but with recognition that had not yet fully formed. And in that moment, the room did not grow louder. It grew still, because something important was about to be understood, not through argument, not through explanation, but through truth revealing itself in its own time. Victoria Hayes did not rush, and that was the first thing everyone noticed, because in a room built on urgency and performance, her stillness carried more authority than any raised voice ever could. Her eyes remained on Ethan as she approached, not scanning, not guessing, but searching with a precision that came from memory rather than curiosity. The soft echo of her steps marked the distance closing between them, and yet Ethan did not shift. He did not straighten his jacket, did not prepare a defense. He simply stood beside his daughter, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Grounded in a calm that did not depend on the room's approval. There seems to be some confusion, Victoria said at last, her voice even, composed, but not distant. It held a quiet control that made the room listen without being told to. The security guard spoke first, his tone respectful but uncertain now. He did not have credentials for the event. We were just following protocol. Victoria nodded slightly, acknowledging the words without fully accepting them. Her gaze moved briefly to the guard, then back to Ethan. Protocol matters, she said softly, but so does perception. The word settled in the air, subtle, but firm enough to shift the weight of the moment. Ethan inclined his head slightly, not in submission, but in recognition of her position. We understand, he said calmly, and we were already leaving. His daughter glanced up at him again, then toward Victoria, her expression open, unguarded, as if she sensed that this moment mattered more than the ones before it. Victoria's eyes softened for just a fraction of a second at the sight of the child, then returned to Ethan, sharper now, more focused. What is your name? She asked, not casually, but deliberately, as if the answer itself carried significance. Ethan paused, not because he did not wish to answer, but because he understood what names could reopen. Ethan Cole, he said finally, his voice steady, unembellished, and something in the room shifted again. Quieter this time, almost imperceptible, but real enough for those paying attention. Victoria's expression did not change immediately, but her eyes did. The recognition was not sudden, it unfolded slowly, like a memory aligning piece by piece. Cole, she repeated under her breath, and then she looked at his wrist, the same watch that had already stirred doubt in another man's mind. Her gaze lingered there for a moment longer than expected, then returned to his face, searching deeper now. "You worked with us before," she said, not as a question, but not yet as a certainty either. Ethan gave a small nod. "A long time ago," he replied, and again, no pride, no claim, just a quiet acknowledgement of something that once was. The room held its breath without realizing it. Conversations had faded entirely now, replaced by a silence that was not empty, but waiting. Victoria took one more step closer, her voice lowering slightly. "You were not just someone who worked here," she said slowly, carefully, as if choosing each word carried weight. "You were part of something critical." Ethan's daughter looked up at him, her eyes widening slightly, as if she was beginning to see a version of her father she had never been told about, and Ethan remained still, his calm unchanged, because for him, truth did not need to be announced to exist, it only needed the right moment to be seen. And as Victoria stood there, the pieces of the past drawing closer to clarity, the room did not erupt, it did not react, it simply grew quieter, because something important was about to be understood, and everyone could feel it, even before it was spoken. Victoria did not look away this time, not from his face, not from the quiet certainty in his posture, because the memory had finally found its place, and when it did not arrive loudly, it arrived with weight. "You were in the East Wing conference room," she said slowly, her voice lower now, more personal. "The night the investors pulled out, when the board thought we were done." A subtle shift moved through the room. A few executives exchanged glances, some recognizing the story, others sensing its importance without fully knowing why. Ethan remained still, his expression unchanged, but there was a faint acknowledgement in his eyes, the kind that did not need to speak to confirm truth. "You stayed," Victoria continued, taking one small step closer. "Everyone else left, or waited to see who would fall first, but you did not." Her words were not dramatic, they were precise, like someone carefully placing pieces back into their original order. The man in the navy suit lowered his gaze slightly, as if realizing the scale of what had almost been dismissed moments ago, and the security guard shifted his stance, no longer certain where he stood in the story unfolding in front of him. Ethan's daughter looked up again, her voice soft, almost curious. "Daddy, what is she talking about?" Ethan glanced down at her, his hand resting gently against her shoulder, grounding her before answering. "Just a long night, sweetheart," he said quietly, and there was no attempt to turn it into something more, no effort to elevate it, just a simple truth wrapped in humility. Victoria exhaled slowly, as if that answer confirmed everything she needed to know. "It was more than a long night," she said, her tone steady but carrying something deeper now, something closer to respect than authority. "You rewrote the entire recovery plan in under 3 hours, you found the gap no one else could see, and you did it without asking for credit." The silence in the room deepened, no longer curious, but attentive, because now the story had direction, and that direction was shifting the way everyone present understood the man standing before them. Ethan did not respond immediately, not out of hesitation, but because there was nothing to defend or claim. His truth had never depended on recognition. "It was a team effort," he said finally, his voice calm, measured, and the simplicity of that answer carried more weight than any explanation could have. Victoria studied him for a moment, not evaluating, not questioning, but understanding. "No," she said quietly, "it was leadership." Her gaze moved briefly across the room, as if allowing others to catch up to the reality she had just spoken, then returned to Ethan. "And we forgot." Those words did not accuse, they did not blame, but they settled heavily, because forgetting something like that was not a small oversight, it was a loss of perspective, and in that moment, the entire lobby seemed to feel it, the polished surfaces, the quiet suits, the measured conversations, all of it paused under the weight of something far more important than status. Ethan's daughter looked between them again, her small voice breaking through the silence in the most honest way possible. "Why did they forget you?" And for a moment, no one answered, because the truth to that question was not simple, it was not comfortable, and it was not loud. Ethan finally looked down at her, his expression soft, steady. "Sometimes people remember results," he said gently, "but they forget the people who helped create them." And as those words settled into the room, something shifted again, not in sound, not in movement, but in understanding, because now it was no longer about who he was, it was about what had been overlooked, and that realization was beginning to change everything. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling into every corner of the lobby like something sacred that no one wanted to disturb, and for the first time since Ethan had stepped inside, no one saw his jacket, no one saw his worn shoes. They saw something else, something they had missed completely. Victoria stood still for a moment longer, then turned slightly toward the security guard, her expression calm but unmistakably firm. "You were doing your job," she said, her voice measured, "but you were looking at the surface, not the substance." The guard straightened immediately, his voice careful. "Yes, but his confidence from earlier had softened into something quieter, something more reflective." Victoria nodded once, then shifted her attention to the rest of the room, her gaze moving across executives, managers, guests, each one now standing in a silence they had not chosen but could not escape. "This company," she said slowly, "was not built by titles alone." Her words were not raised, yet they carried across the space with clarity. It was built by people who showed up when it mattered most, even when no one was watching. A few heads lowered slightly, not out of shame, but recognition, the kind that arrives too late but still matters. Ethan remained still, his posture unchanged, as if the moment unfolding around him belonged more to them than to him. His daughter looked up again, her eyes wide now, not with confusion, but with something closer to pride, though she did not fully understand why. Victoria turned back to Ethan, her voice softer now, more personal. "You should have never been treated as if you did not belong here," she said, and there was no performance in her tone, no corporate distance, only truth. Ethan gave a small nod, accepting the words without absorbing their weight as something owed. "It is all right," he replied calmly. "Respect is not something you can demand from a moment, it comes from how people choose to see you over time." The simplicity of his answer lingered longer than any speech could have, and the room absorbed it, quietly, thoughtfully. Victoria studied him again, and this time there was no hesitation left, only clarity. "Then let us choose correctly now," she said, turning slightly as if addressing both him and the space around them. "You are not a guest here," she continued, her voice steady. "You are part of the foundation of this place." A subtle shift rippled through the crowd, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, because those words did not elevate him artificially, they restored something that had been overlooked. The man in the navy suit exhaled slowly, as if releasing a tension he had not realized he carried, and even the guard lowered his gaze briefly, understanding now that the moment had moved far beyond protocol. Ethan's daughter looked up at him again, her voice soft but filled with quiet wonder. "Daddy, does that mean we can stay?" Ethan looked down at her, and for the first time, there was the faintest trace of something warmer in his expression, not pride, not relief, but something deeper, something like peace. "We will stay for a little while," he said gently, then he glanced up at Victoria, meeting her eyes with the same calm he had carried from the beginning. "But not because we have to." Victoria nodded slowly, understanding completely, and in that moment, no applause came. No voices rose, the room did not celebrate. It simply became still, because respect, when it is real, does not make noise, it creates silence, and in that silence, everyone finally saw him clearly. The room did not return to normal, not immediately, because something invisible had shifted beneath the polished surface, something deeper than status or hierarchy, and as people slowly resumed their movements, their voices stayed lower, their glances more thoughtful, as if each person was quietly recalibrating what they believed mattered. Victoria stepped slightly to the side, giving Ethan space rather than surrounding him. A subtle gesture that spoke louder than authority ever could. "The scholarship event is on the second floor," she said, her tone now softer, almost respectful in a way that needed no announcement. "Your daughter is exactly where she is meant to be." Ethan nodded once, acknowledging her words without letting them define the moment, because for him, the purpose had never changed. He had come for his daughter, not for recognition, and now that purpose remained steady, unchanged. He looked down at her, offering a small, reassuring smile. "You ready?" he asked gently, and she nodded quickly, her earlier hesitation replaced by something brighter, something steadier, as if the world had just shown her a lesson she did not yet have words for but would remember for a long time. As they began to move toward the elevators, the path in front of them opened naturally. No one instructed it, no one announced it, people simply stepped aside, not out of obligation, but out of quiet respect. The same guard who had stopped them earlier shifted slightly, his posture no longer rigid, his voice careful. "Sir," he said, and for a moment he paused, choosing his words more thoughtfully than before. "I am sorry." Ethan stopped briefly, not to linger, but to acknowledge. He met the guard's eyes with calm understanding. "You were doing what you thought was right." he said quietly. "Just remember to look a little deeper next time." The guard nodded, absorbing the words not as correction, but as guidance. And as Ethan and his daughter stepped into the elevator, the doors closing softly behind them, the lobby remained still for a moment longer, as if no one wanted to break what had just been learned. Inside the elevator, the hum of motion replaced the silence of the room, and his daughter looked up at him again, her voice softer now, more certain. "You really helped build this place." Ethan leaned lightly against the wall, his expression calm. "I helped when it needed it," he replied, and she studied him for a second, then smiled, a small, genuine smile that carried pride without needing explanation. "I knew you were special," she said, and Ethan's gaze softened in a way that no one in the lobby had seen, not because of what she said, but because of how she believed it without needing proof. The elevator doors opened to a quieter floor, filled with rows of chairs, banners, and young students waiting with hopeful eyes, a different kind of room, one not built on power, but on possibility. Ethan stepped forward, guiding his daughter into the space, blending in again, just another parent among many, no spotlight, no announcement, just presence. And as the event began, no one in that room knew what had just happened downstairs. No one knew the story that had quietly reshaped a moment of judgment into something else entirely, but Ethan did not need them to know. Because dignity does not grow from recognition, it grows from consistency. And as he sat beside his daughter, watching her listen, learn, and hope, the world outside the room faded, leaving only what had always mattered most, not who he was to others, but who he chose to be when it mattered. And in that quiet, unseen moment, that choice spoke louder than anything the room downstairs could have ever said. The room upstairs carried a different kind of silence, not the heavy stillness of realization, but the quiet anticipation of hope. Rows of young students sitting with their parents, some fidgeting, some whispering, some holding folders filled with dreams they could not yet measure, and among them sat Ethan and his daughter, no longer standing out, no longer being watched, just part of something simple and real, the kind of place where effort mattered more than image. And as the presenter stepped onto the small stage, adjusting the microphone with a soft hum of feedback, Ethan's daughter leaned slightly closer, her attention focused, her earlier uncertainty now replaced with something steadier, something rooted. "Do you think I can do this?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying that familiar mix of doubt and hope that only children ask with complete honesty. Ethan looked at her, not quickly, not casually, but with the same calm presence he had carried through every moment before. "You already are," he said gently, and she blinked, processing the answer. "How?" she asked. And Ethan gave a faint smile. "By showing up, by trying, by believing you belong even when it feels like you do not." She nodded slowly, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of her folder, as if holding onto something invisible but important. And as the first names were called, the room shifted into a rhythm of applause and quiet nerves. One by one, students walked to the stage, some confident, some hesitant, each carrying their own story, and Ethan watched, not distracted, not distant, but present in a way that did not need attention. Because for him, this was the moment that mattered, not the recognition downstairs, not the past being remembered, but this, right here, where his daughter had a chance to step forward. And when her name was finally called, it came softly over the microphone, but to her, it sounded louder than anything else. She looked at him for just a second, and he nodded once, steady, reassuring. "Go," he said, and she stood, taking a breath before walking toward the stage, her step small at first, then stronger, and as she reached the front, she turned briefly, just enough to see him still sitting there, still calm, still certain, and that was enough. She faced forward again, her voice a little shaky at first as she introduced herself, but it did not break, it grew steadier with each word, because belief, once given, has a way of holding itself together. And when she finished, there was applause, not overwhelming, not dramatic, but genuine, the kind that comes from recognizing effort. And as she walked back, her eyes found Ethan immediately, searching for confirmation, and he gave a small nod, the same quiet approval he had always given, and she smiled, not wide, not loud, but real. And in that moment, nothing else mattered, not the building, not the people downstairs, not the story that had almost been forgotten, because this was the continuation of something greater, something quieter, something that did not need a stage to exist. And as the event moved on, the light from the windows shifted slowly across the floor, marking time without urgency. And when it was over, when students began to gather their things and parents stood to meet them, Ethan remained seated for a moment longer. Watching his daughter laugh softly with another student, her earlier hesitation now replaced with confidence she had earned in her own way, and when she returned to him, her voice brighter now, she asked the question that had been waiting quietly beneath everything: "Daddy, why did you not tell them who you were before?"